When Thomas Gray rolled back into the quiet valley where his family's ranch had stood for more than a century, he expected to be greeted by silence, open fields, and the comforting creak of the old barn doors, not by the sight of neon orange. HOA violation signs nailed to the fence posts of his own property, fluttering in the breeze like hostile flags declaring war, and certainly not by the shrill voice of a woman in oversized sunglasses and a fake pearl necklace storming across the gravel driveway yelling about how he had no permission to be on community property, because Thomas knew better than anyone alive that no matter what anyone in this valley thought, this ranch wasn't just his home. It was the place his family had built before the town even existed, land bought and paid for generations before. The concept of an HOA had even been invented, but still here came Karen Montgomery, the self-appointed president of the new HOA that had mushroomed over the last 5 years, marching across his land like she owned it, clipboard in hand, barking about code violations and unauthorized livestock, as though his cattle grazing on his land somehow fell under her little rule book. And when Thomas calmly told her she had no authority here, she snapped her fingers like a queen, summoning servants, signaling 2 so-called compliance officers in matching polo shirts who stepped out of a white SUV marked HOA Patrol and began snapping photos of his ranch house, the barn, and even his truck, as if documenting crimes. And Thomas, leaning against the fence post with his hat shading his eyes, just watched them without a word. Because while Karen thought she had cornered another helpless homeowner, she had no idea who she was dealing with. No idea that Thomas wasn't just some rancher returning home after years away, but the very man who, in Washington, D.C. boardrooms and courtrooms, oversaw every HOA charter in the United States. The man whose signature was required before any HOA bylaws became legally enforceable. The man Karen's entire authority ultimately traced back to, though she wouldn't know that until it was far too late, and when she threatened to call the cops if he didn't vacate the premises immediately. Thomas finally smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that made her falter, because there was something unsettling in the way he didn't flinch or argue, just tipped his hat and said, "Go ahead, Karen, make the call," knowing full well that the minute law enforcement set foot on his land, jurisdiction and authority would unravel in ways she couldn't even imagine. And as she pulled out her phone and began dramatically narrating to dispatch how a trespasser was refusing to leave HOA-controlled land, Thomas thought back to the years he had spent drafting federal regulations, negotiating with state attorneys general, and dismantling corrupt HOA boards across the country. And he realized in that moment that maybe fate had sent him home not just to reclaim his land, but to make an example out of the petty tyrants who thought homeowners' rights were theirs to toy with. So when the first squad car pulled up 20 minutes later, gravel crunching under its tires, and 2 deputies stepped out with confused expressions because they knew Thomas, knew his family, and couldn't quite figure out why Karen was shrieking about arresting the man who practically kept the county running. The stage was set for the battle that would expose not just Karen's arrogance, but the entire rotten foundation of the HOA empire she thought she controlled. And as Thomas squared his shoulders and prepared to reveal pieces of his true identity, he thought about how many families across America had suffered under people like her. How many lives had been upended by bogus fines, foreclosures, and harassment. And he decided right then that this story wasn't just going to be about his ranch. It was going to be about dismantling a culture of abuse, one HOA at a time, starting with the woman currently demanding his arrest. So if you're watching this story unfold, make sure to hit subscribe right now, because trust me, what happens next will blow your mind, and you don't want to miss a single twist as Karen learns who Thomas Gray really is. The sheriff's deputies who stepped out of the cruiser exchanged awkward glances as Karen ranted about trespassing, property codes, and how Thomas needed to be removed immediately for violating community guidelines. But the deputies knew. The Gray family ranch had existed since before the town even had paved roads. And one of them, Deputy Collins, actually remembered Thomas from years ago when he had come back to donate funds for the local school. So instead of cuffing him as Karen demanded, Collins politely asked Thomas for ID. And when Thomas handed over a leather wallet with a federal badge tucked behind his driver's license, Collins's eyes widened just enough to betray that he understood exactly who he was dealing with, and though Thomas gave him a subtle nod that meant, "Play along, but don't say anything yet," Karen misinterpreted the silence as weakness and began shrieking about how the HOA would sue the county if the deputies didn't comply, which made Collins smirk, because no county judge in the state would ever entertain an HOA lawsuit against law enforcement, especially not against someone with Thomas Gray's credentials. And still, Karen pressed forward, instructing her compliance officers to document everything for the board, which was almost comical because Thomas himself had chaired the national board that approved their very charter, and as more neighbors gathered along the dirt road, whispering and filming with their phones, Thomas decided it was time to shift gears. So he invited the deputies inside his ranch house, unlocking the heavy oak door that hadn't been opened in years, and once inside, he laid out a thick leather portfolio on the dining table, flipping it open to reveal not only ownership deeds, dating back to 1899, but also federal oversight documents signed by the Secretary of Housing himself. And when Collins skimmed the papers, his jaw tightened as he realized this wasn't just a man protecting his home, this was the man whose pen authorized the very existence of every HOA in the country. And Thomas leaned forward, voice low and steady, telling the deputies that the real reason he returned wasn't just to reclaim his family ranch, but to confront the corruption festering here. Because Karen's HOA wasn't just issuing citations, they had been overstepping authority, forging liens and bankrupting families, a pattern Thomas had tracked across the nation, and this valley was just the latest battleground. And outside, Karen grew more impatient, calling her attorney on speakerphone, loudly boasting about how her HOA controlled the ranch because of updated zoning covenants. But when she stormed into the dining room mid-rant, she froze at the sight of Thomas calmly sitting with law enforcement, his portfolio of documents spread before him like a courtroom exhibit. And though she puffed up her chest and tried to assert control, Thomas finally dropped the first bombshell. "Karen, every letter, every fine, every lien you've ever issued had to pass through an office that reports directly to me," and as silence filled the room, her attorney's tinny voice on the phone sputtered, asking her what he meant. Thomas produced another folder, this one full of investigative reports detailing how Karen's HOA had illegally seized 3 homes on the outskirts of the valley, falsifying compliance records to justify foreclosure, and he handed them to the deputies, who immediately recognized criminal fraud. But Thomas wasn't finished, because this was about more than one corrupt HOA. This was about exposing a network of self-appointed tyrants who had gone unchecked too long. So he revealed that federal oversight hearings were already scheduled in D.C., and Karen's name was on the docket. And while she stammered and tried to laugh it off as bluffing, the sound of approaching engines outside silenced everyone for 3 black SUVs with government plates rolled up the driveway, and men in suits stepped out, not with guns drawn, but with briefcases and official subpoenas, because Thomas had orchestrated this from the moment he arrived, knowing Karen would overplay her hand, and now the full weight of federal authority had descended on her little empire. And as the neighbors outside gasped and whispered, realizing the HOA president who had terrorized them for years was suddenly the one cornered, Thomas leaned back, letting the agents announce that the entire HOA board was under investigation for racketeering, misuse of funds, and fraud, charges that could carry decades in prison. And though Karen shrieked about conspiracies and demanded the agents arrest Thomas instead, the deputies actually laughed, reminding her that Thomas wasn't just a rancher. He was the national director who oversaw the legitimacy of every HOA in the United States. And when the agents escorted Karen outside in handcuffs, the neighbors erupted in cheers, phones capturing every second. Thomas didn't gloat. He didn't even smile, because he knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. And in the quiet that followed, he sat at his dining table, fingers steepled, already thinking ahead to the next step, because exposing Karen was one thing. But dismantling an entire culture of abuse would take more than one victory. It would take a war, and Thomas Gray was ready to wage it. When news of Karen's downfall hit social media, the footage of her being hauled away in handcuffs by federal agents went viral overnight, and what began as a local scandal in one quiet valley spread like wildfire across the nation, igniting conversations in suburbs, gated communities, and city councils about the unchecked power of HOAs. And suddenly Thomas Gray was no longer just a man reclaiming his ranch, but the face of a movement, the man neighbors everywhere began to call the HOA Sheriff, though in truth his role was far greater than any title could capture, because, as director of the National Oversight Board, he possessed authority few even realized existed. Authority to suspend charters, dissolve boards, and even seize control of HOA funds when corruption was proven, and when he traveled to Washington weeks later, walking into a congressional hearing room packed with cameras, reporters, and furious lobbyists who had grown rich off the backs of homeowners, he understood the scale of what he had unleashed, because Karen had not acted alone. She was one of thousands of small tyrants empowered by a system that thrived on intimidation, bogus fines, and the threat of foreclosure. And now every one of them felt the ground shaking beneath their feet. And as he sat before the committee, flanked by binders of evidence collected from across the country, Thomas spoke not as a bureaucrat, but as a man who had lived the abuse firsthand, recounting stories of veterans fined for flying the American flag, single mothers bankrupted over mailbox paint colors, retirees thrown out of homes they had paid off decades earlier, and with each story, the committee's faces hardened, until even senators who had once defended HOAs for campaign donations now leaned forward with grim expressions, sensing a storm they could not contain. And while the lobbyists whispered frantically, and the cameras rolled, Thomas laid out his plan, a sweeping reform act that would strip HOAs of foreclosure powers, cap fines at reasonable amounts, and place every board under direct federal audit. And though the lobbyists hissed that it was government overreach, the public outcry outside the Capitol was deafening, thousands of families rallying in support, holding signs with slogans like "Homes Not Hostages" and "End HOA Tyranny." And when the bill passed its first vote with overwhelming bipartisan support, the dominoes began to fall as dozens of corrupt HOA presidents resigned overnight, fleeing before investigations could catch up. But Thomas didn't let them run, because his task force, built from federal investigators and local law enforcement who had seen enough, swept through state after state, seizing records, freezing accounts, and bringing charges that stretched from wire fraud to racketeering. And soon headlines screamed of multi-million-dollar embezzlements uncovered in Florida, of families restored to homes in Texas, of wrongful foreclosures reversed in California, and through it all, Thomas remained calm, focused, always returning. In the evenings, to the quiet of his family ranch, where neighbors now came by with pies and handshakes, thanking him for fighting battles they thought were unwinnable. But the climax came months later when the National HOA Council, a powerful lobby that had long operated like a shadow government, summoned Thomas to their annual summit in Chicago, confident they could intimidate him into backing down. And as he walked into the grand ballroom filled with suited men and women who had built fortunes off homeowners' misery, he faced their sneers with the same quiet confidence he had shown Karen on that first day. And when the chairman accused him of destroying a proud American institution, Thomas placed a stack of documents on the podium, evidence showing how the council itself had laundered millions through bogus legal fees. And then, to the shock of everyone in the room, federal marshals poured in and served indictments on half the board, live-streamed to the public outside. And in that moment, the illusion of untouchable power shattered. the empire of fear collapsing under its own corruption. And as the crowd erupted in chaos, Thomas's voice carried above the din. Home ownership is a right, not a privilege sold back to you with strings attached, words that became a rallying cry across the nation, etched into headlines and history. And when the dust settled, the reforms became law, stripping away the worst abuses and returning freedom to millions of homeowners. And though Thomas could have stayed in Washington as a hero, he chose instead to come back to his valley, to sit once more on the porch of his ranch with the evening sun sinking behind the hills. Because he hadn't done this for glory or headlines, he had done it so families everywhere could live in peace. And as the wind rustled the grass and the barn doors creaked in the twilight, he thought of Karen, once so smug and untouchable, now just another name in a case file, a reminder that arrogance built on fraud always falls. And with that thought, he tipped his hat, leaned back in his chair, and finally allowed himself the faintest of smiles, knowing the war had been won, not just for him, but for everyone who ever called a house a home.